In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make some wild yeast bread, also known as sourdough. This recipe happens to be gluten-free, vegan, and allergen-friendly. So if you want to learn how to make a really nice loaf of bread, keep watching and I'll show you how to do it.
For this video, I baked 4 loaves. I've numbered them to make it easier to reference throughout the video. Each loaf was pretty much the same except for the amount of water I added.
Another difference in this recipe, even though the ingredients are fairly similar to other recipes I've done in the past, we're actually using a stand mixer today because if you want to level up your skills, I thought that that would be the next best step because typically I mix everything by hand, but using a stand mixer is kind of nice and it's easier, so we're going to use it today. The steps are simple for this recipe, but you do need a gluten-free sourdough starter. If you haven't made one yet, I will include a link in the description, and so you can go make your first sourdough starter and then come back and rewatch this video once you're ready to make your loaf. If you already have a sourdough starter, you can take it out of the fridge if that's where you've been keeping it, and we're going to refresh it with some flour, approximately 1/4 cup, 25 grams, and or a heaping tablespoon of fresh flour with just enough water to stir. It's okay if it's on the thicker side. You're going to cover it and you're going to place it on your kitchen counter overnight until the morning. Then, first thing in the morning, you are going to take a portion of that starter, and if you decide to leave it in your jar, that is fine. Just make sure that there's enough space for about 2 extra cups of starter. And we're going to feed the wild yeast that you already have an additional cup of flour and a cup of water. If you don't think you have enough space in your jar, you can take a portion and feed it in a separate bowl. And same thing, you're going to feed it 1 cup of water, 1 cup of flour, and mix it. And at this point, it's okay if it's thinner. I designed this recipe with that in mind. So it will be thin, but when it does get active, it should be very bubbly. And when that happens is when you want to mix it with the other ingredients of this recipe.
And if at any point your starter separates, don't pour the water out. The wild yeast needs time. You can, on the other hand, stir it a couple times if you've decided to use the second method.
Another thing I've tweaked for this recipe is that I've increased the amount of psyllium husk that I use, and I'm also adding flaxseed meal. Ideally, what you want to do for the psyllium and the flax is you want to put it in a separate bowl. I use a 2-cup measuring bowl because it works well. You could just use any bowl, it doesn't matter. So today I did put the psyllium, the whole psyllium, into my spice grinder to grind it into a finer powder. And I did the same thing with my golden flaxseed meal. It's fine to use it as is, but if you mill it, it will just be finer. Combine both the psyllium and the flax, and I will add 1.5 cups of water. This water is warm just because it will help to gel all the mixture together. So that's the half, and that's 1 here. And you want to mix it well because it won't take long and both ingredients will gel and will thicken.
Someone asked me if I ever combine my starter with my binders. Well, I tried it for one of the loaves, but it didn't really change much. In addition of being allergen friendly, this recipe is also free of corn, legumes, oil, and can also be oat-free. For more information about allergen-friendly ingredients, please visit freshasreal.com and read the flour guide. I will include a link in the description of this video.
All right, it's been 7 hours since we fed the starter into a separate bowl, and I'm happy with where it's at. It's bubbly, and the water that you could see on the surface earlier has absorbed into the wild yeast, and I think it's ready to use.
If you chose method 1 to feed your starter, then you will need to measure about 2 cups or approximately 520 grams if you fed your starter in your jar. The final notes will be in the recipe, so please reference the instructions.
So for your stand mixer, depending on if you have different attachments, the first few times I used the dough hook, but I kind of feel like this one works better for me, but it's personal choice. You do what works best for you. And I do want to Mentioned that it is important to sift your flours. You can whisk them, but I find that sifting them makes sure that there's no leftover clumps of flour or starches in your bread recipe, because I think that's an important detail. What I like to do after I've measured, and in today's case I actually weighed all my ingredients, I like to put everything through the sifter just to make sure that it's not clumpy. This recipe includes sorghum flour, and today I'm using buckwheat flour. The recipe calls for white rice flour, but you can also use oat flour if you want. In this recipe, you can include arrowroot starch, tapioca starch, whichever one you have, but keep in mind that I also include potato starch. So including at least 2 starches really helps to bind everything together and create a nice light fluffy texture.
If you enjoy bread videos like this one, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share.
I also add coconut palm sugar, but I feel like that's an optional ingredient. If you did not want to include sugar, it would work equally well, so that's entirely up to you. An important ingredient to add in a bread recipe is salt. In this one, I include a fine gray sea salt, and I'm putting 1 tablespoon. I have to, and this is the part I always struggle with, but I've been taking notes throughout all these bakes because you can't improve what you're doing if you don't write down what you try, because different ingredients act differently, absorb water differently. Yeah, so it's best to take notes anytime you make a tweak just so you can better track what you're doing. All right, so we're ready to mix the dry ingredients with the psyllium and flax gel mixture along with the starter and then some more water. At this point, it doesn't really matter which one you add first, but you can kind of put both in. But as you can tell, the psyllium is like a big blobby jelly mixture. And that's exactly what you're looking for. I'm just gonna put this in here. The sourdough starter is very thin, but like I said before, I wanted it to be thinner in this recipe, but it's lively and bubbly, and we're gonna also add that to the ingredients. But we can turn the mixer on mine, it will be the lowest setting, and gently start to mix it.
Okay, so this is the part that you will have to play around with. What I suggest is adding 1/4 cup of water to start, up to 1/2 cup in total. In this particular loaf, I added way too much. I think it was 3/4 cup in total. The loaf turned out nice, but the dough was wet and the loaf was way too moist. After about 1 minute of mixing, you should notice some dry ingredients left at the bottom. That's the perfect time to add the 1/4 cup.
I'm just gonna see what the dough looks like now. And this is where you're gonna have to judge, right? Because depending on the brand of ingredients you use, if it was seeds or grains that you milled yourself, some of them might be more absorbent than others, right?
This was the consistency of the dough for the second loaf, and it was actually perfect.
The idea is you want just enough water to help you combine all the ingredients, and that looks really good. I will dust my countertop with some flour, and in this case it is brown rice. And we're gonna gently stretch and fold the dough before we put it in a banneton basket, or if you don't have one, you can use a soup bowl.
Make sure to watch through the whole dough shaping part, as I will show you what to do with a very sticky dough and one that you can actually shape with your hands.
I'm even going to dust the dough itself because it is kind of sticky, and I could even put a little bit on my hands. But basically all we're gonna do, oh, you know what? I could use my dough scraper too. Well, let's assume that you don't have a dough scraper and a bench scraper. We're just gonna use our hands. So as you can tell, it's very stretchy, and we're just gonna Is this step necessary? Could I just put this in my basket? Maybe. And see, I added more water. So for that reason, my dough is stickier, right? Okay, so enough with that because it's sticky. As you can tell, I can't do much. So I am going to just try to add it to a very well floured banneton basket. So I am just going to pick this up, put it in my basket. And in this case, you know what, maybe trying to fold it and stretch it was almost pointless because it's such a wet dough.
The dough for loaf number 2 seemed a little bit drier, but it had a really nice consistency. And as you can tell, I had to work a little bit harder to knead it, I guess. This is the only one that I had to do that with. It felt drier, but in the end, once you see the final loaf and the rise, it was actually really, really nice. So sometimes a little less water can create the perfect dough as well.
Much better. Yesterday it was too wet. And just to show you, this I know will be a dough that I can manipulate with my hands. Definitely. I'm gonna dust it with just a little bit more flour. And all I want you to do is just try to stretch it a little bit and fold it just a few times. We're not kneading it per se, but we do want to create a nice dough ball. Yesterday, I was desperately looking for this when I was stuck with my really sticky dough. But if you have that, you can definitely use it to help you tuck in the dough a little bit better. In the last few loaves, I actually used a banneton basket. And just for today, I'm going to show you that it's okay just to use a bowl. This dough ball is larger than what I typically have, so I'm going to use this bowl today. So all you have to do is line it with a clean tea towel. You can dust it with a little bit more flour. Because it's kind of gray and cold today, I will insert it in a plastic bag just to help with the rise. If you have Ziploc bags, you can use that. If not, just any bag will do. And again, place it somewhere warm. In the summertime, it could be much faster to rise, 2 to 4 hours, but today it could be like 4 to 6. So let's see, we'll check on it in about 3 hours, and then we'll see how it's doing.
At the 3-hour mark, I checked on the dough and it was looking really good, but it was kind of still pretty wet and kind of jiggly. Anyway, so I kind of felt like I needed to come up with a plan B. That's when I decided to line a bread pan with some parchment paper, and I dusted the pan with some flour and I transferred the dough into that bread pan. And I covered it and let it rise for an additional hour or so. Before we continue with scoring and baking the bread, I thought I would take a second to show you the inside of my oven. I often have a baking stone preheating at the same time as my Dutch oven, but the baking stone is not necessary. But if you do have one, or a baking tiles or baking steel, you can preheat it at the same time. Now on to the fun part. So if scoring your loaf stresses you out a little bit, don't you worry. What I would do is take a moment before you actually score your loaf and just sketch out any ideas that you might have. Sometimes simpler is better, because you will see in one of my loaves that I kind of tried to go fancy and I didn't really like how it ended up looking like. So again, simpler is better. With the right amount of water, this is what you can expect your dough to look like. So when you gently press down on it, it should just bounce back. After 4 to 6 hours, when your dough is ready, you can transfer the dough onto a piece of parchment paper and then dust your dough with a little bit of flour, and then you're ready to score. To score your loaf, you can use a sharp knife or If you come across a bread scoring knife, you can try that as well. Or you could just use the lamb from the scoring knife, and that works equally well, but be careful, it's very sharp. The main score lines can be about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch deep, and any additional decorative lines can be less than 1/8 of an inch deep. Okay, so maybe this one was more my style. Simple, one main score line with some decorative lines on the side. To score this loaf, I actually used an X-Acto knife that I keep just for this purpose. For loaf number 3, the scoring line was kept pretty simple. The dough was already cracking, so I used it to my advantage, and then I just added a few decorative lines. For loaf number 4, I think I tried to get a little fancy and artistic. I added a little bit of olive oil to help me stick the poppy seeds a little bit better, but I also had leftover bits of seeds and whatnot, so I decided to rub that all over the rest of the space. I then cut out a moon shape in a piece of parchment paper to help me spread the poppy seeds. Then I did 2 main score lines with just a few decorative lines. Don't be afraid to experiment, just have fun with it. The next step will be to remove the preheated Dutch oven from your oven. And then with the help of the parchment paper, we're going to transfer the dough into the pot, and be careful, it will be super hot. And then you have the option of adding a few ice cubes under the parchment paper or misting your loaf with a little bit of water. Doing so will help create some steam when you cover your pot. Then you're going to bake your loaf for 25 minutes covered, 25 minutes uncovered, and about 10 minutes or so directly on the middle rack or the baking stone. I even baked the bread pan loaf into my Dutch oven. After 25 minutes of baking, don't forget to remove the cover and then return it to the oven for an additional 25 minutes uncovered. For the last 10 minutes, you want to remove the loaf from the Dutch oven and return it to the oven on the middle rack or on the baking stone. And if you need to, you can go ahead and tap it just to see how it's doing. A good indication that your loaf is ready is when you tap it all over and it sounds hard and hollow.
All right, let's just make sure that this is ready. For me, as long as when I tap it, if it sounds like this everywhere, that's how I judge. And usually it's ready, but if you touch it and it's soft, just return it to the oven for a little bit longer. But, come on. I don't know how this loaf is going to turn out this way. Today was kind of weird and I'm kind of tired, it's late. Everything was kind of like delayed because the process and the steps took a little bit longer. So even though this recipe wasn't really hard to make, it just took a little bit longer. But I'm very curious about the crumb of this loaf. So maybe adding a little bit of water or extra water is great for the rise, but it doesn't create a dough that you can manipulate with your hands. So you just kind of have to figure out which option you want to try. So I need to let this cool, and I'm gonna let it cool overnight. And you know what? I think I'm gonna bake another loaf tomorrow. I'm just gonna tweak the measurements a little bit, and because I want to offer and share the recipe that's gonna yield the best loaf pretty much every time consistently, right? So after that, if you want to tweak the amount of water you use based on the flours or the ingredients that you try, and that will, you know, ultimately be up to you. But I'm very happy and I can't wait to slice it. Right now it's hard, but as the loaf cools, the crust will actually get a little bit softer.
One of the best tips I can offer when you make wild yeast bread is to wait until it's completely cool before you slice it. For 2 of these loaves, I kind of got impatient and I sliced them after 6 hours and they were still warm inside. So wait overnight if you can. Let's go over each loaf. I would have to say that this was probably my favorite loaf. It had a really good texture. The crumb was nice. It was soft and squishy without being too moist. In terms of looks, I think number 2 is probably the prettiest. I really liked the simplicity of it, and it rose really well. It had a tighter crumb, but it tasted really good. Loaf number 3 was definitely an experiment. I added more water in that loaf, so the dough was way stickier. It baked surprisingly nice. It created a very good open crumb, but the texture was moist, a little bit too moist. The bread itself was nice and squishy, but as you can tell, because of the addition of the extra water, I did have a flying crust. Overall, this loaf actually made really good toast. And as for loaf number 4, it was pretty consistent with what I would expect with a wild yeast bread. It had good texture, good crumb, and good flavor. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
Okay, let's do that again. And that's it. 7 steps. That's it.